evening, my esteemed colleagues. It is an honor to be here, to the bishops, the reverends, academic, civil society. I know my fellow speakers that are here, the organizers. I want to say all protocol observed. It is an honor to speak at this very auspicious occasion. And I'm really just a child who wants to make a difference. I really just want to make an impact in this nation. And my passion is economics and development. And I'm going to take you through a strategy that I devised together with a colleague of mine. His name is Mark Swilling, professor at Stellenbosch Business School. And I really just want to put forward some solutions that I believe can be effective for this country to move forward. And I titled it New Wine into New Wine Skin, because I believe you cannot pour old wine into new skin and expect an outcome. And I'll explain why I say that and what the basis thereof is. Where does Africa come from? Africa comes from a place where we were an oasis of knowledge. What I'm showing you behind me is Timbuktu in what is now modern day Mali, in the West African part of this world. If you look towards where there's a lot of regional conflict now, Burkina Faso, Niger, all those areas, right there on the western parts is Timbuktu, where we have the world's greatest academic and commercial center. If you think it's not there, it's still there. These structures are still standing. This is from 500 AD. Here was what we call the Harvard of the world in Africa. Here is where salt and ivory were traded, and you saw many move through what I call the Trans-Saharan Atlantic trade route. And this was one of the fundamental places where our people would trade and move goods, services, buying and selling. Where? In Africa. Now, we know that it was also an academic and commercial hub. We know that scholarly people came from here. Africans from Egypt all the way to the great Zimbabwe, not the modern Zimbabwe as we know, Rhodesia, but the great southern Zimbabwe, which is the central southern part of the continent. We were people, an oasis of knowledge, of maths, of science, of people that actually used to come here for all art and religion back in the time when this was the hub. What happened? I'll talk to you about what happened. But more than 100,000 global scholars would go through the Western African parts and other parts of Africa, but we were what I call the economic hub, the scientific hub, the mathematical hub, a place of scholarship and a place where solutions emanated, and we were not on the back of underdevelopment. Fast forward to about 7-8 years ago, you see also on the rise are Africa's fastest growing economies. The World Economic Forum looks at every year who are the fastest growing economies, where do they emanate? Of the 12 fastest growing economies, 6 of them emanate from where? Africa. Ethiopia, one of the fastest growing economies from around 2017, 2015, 2016, 2017. And you see there that agriculture, manufacturing, energy, and some of the subsectors within manufacturing are the reason for their growth. What is the growth level that they had? 9%, 8.5%, 10.5%. The Democratic Republic of Congo at the same time had an average growth rate of 8.62%. Forget about South Africa's 0.3%. Look at Cote d'Ivoire. 8, 7, 7.5, an average during that time of 7.8%. What was this on the back of? Again, you see some of the subsectors, manufacturing, agricultural processing, cocoa beans, coffee and palm oil, and the like. Mozambique, Tanzania, Rwanda follow suit. The lowest average growth you see here, 7%. How did they do it? Why is it that South Africa is sitting with a situation of 0.3% growth? Can we learn from these countries? Absolutely. What I want to tell you, the conundrum though, is that 6 of these countries lie on the UNCTAD's least developed countries list. growth alone is not sufficient. If you look at the UNCTAD map that I've just shown you, the least developed countries are those that are highlighted in brown. And you will see here that as I go and show you those countries, the 6 of the 7 fastest growing countries are still least developed. The majority of them are in sub-Saharan Africa. But why are they least developed? It's because of the pattern of growth. It's because we do not manufacture. It's because we do not develop our own products, goods, and we buy, and the design of our economies is largely to import and export our minerals. This has not changed. Even if you are growing fast, this has really not changed significantly, and very few have been able to get it right. And I'll tell you what are the reasons for this. So we know that our continent has underdevelopment, has poverty, high level of unemployment. But what is the necessary condition to outcomes? And I think that one of the things that I want to focus on is this issue of, I want to just put a pointer here, the type of growth. So over the last decade, the African Development Bank has looked at all 54 nations in Africa. On your left, you see a graph. This graph that I'm focusing on here tells you where does the growth come from. If you look into the graph, you'll see that the green is the biggest chunk of growth. What is that green? Can anyone tell me? Consumption. Africans are consumers. If you unpack South Africa's economic growth strategy over the last 2 decades, you will see the same trend. We are consumers. If you look at where the other growth areas, gross investments, which is the foreign direct investment, private sector investment, all the others, it follows closely. Depending on the year, it can be larger than net exports, but it is not the highest. By far, consumption is the lead driver of growth in Africa as well as South Africa. We also see government expenditure as well as your trade, which is this maroon. Note the trade. In some years, we have very small percentages of trade. Trade only matters when you sell more than you bring in. Your balance of payments, or what we call the currency that comes in. If you are exporting less than you are buying from China, from US, from the Europeans, more of your money is going out. So it is then you have a deficit, a trade deficit. And we see in some years the continent, not just South Africa, but the continent is unable, with all of its policies and growth relationships with the AGOA, the Chinese, is unable to sell more than it actually buys. That's a problem. Fundamentally, why? Because of the type of growth we have. We grow from largely a services growth, services-led growth path. Our industrial and our agricultural follow. Services is about 60 to 65% of our GDP, our gross domestic product, and most of our economic output comes from financial services, properties, right? Government services. Manufacturing or industry takes usually less than a fifth of our economic output. And also it is dwindling. We are deindustrializing. We as Africans are always encouraged, deindustrialize, it doesn't matter. You don't have to manufacture. Academics will even argue, unless you are competitive, you do not need to manufacture. Where have you ever heard of such a thing? No country. The East Asian tigers have not grown on the back of importing the large majority of the goods they produce. They've understood that to grow their economies, they have to have a growth strategy that is on the back of growing their industrial capability, but also expanding those products and selling them to those who will buy. And who's the buyer? It's Africans. And so the strategy that we have to employ is to change the structure. We have to change our structural growth path. We have to increase our economic output from industry, or what we call manufacturing, or secondary services. We have to increase our ability to produce. Largely, there's a lot of arguments from academia and all kind of voices around agriculture. However, agriculture leads and is an input into industrialization. The type of agriculture you have, you've got want to avoid the primary low-scale subsistence agriculture to more small-scale mechanized and large-scale commercial agriculture, but also multiply it at a community level, and the community then begins to supply inputs into the farming value chain. I'll skip this for purposes of time, but what you see here is that the Chinese, the Indians, the Ethiopians, the Turkish, they have the highest per capita GDP across emerging markets. South Africa is dwindling. Brazil, United Arab Emirates are at the lower end. And what you see is that the growth drivers of many of these nations, I was fortunate to go to Egypt not too long ago. And when you look at the structure of the economy, and I was speaking around the economic structure of the Egyptians, they are highly industrialized. If you look at their exports and you unpack their trade numbers, you begin to see that the Egyptians understand that why they are at the forefront and are now one of the superpowers on this continent is because the structure of growth that they have is largely led by industrialization, mechanization. And I say the reason why South Africa has the highest level of inequality, this is against other African counterparts. So we think we're better than the rest of Africa, right? Many a time. Well, I'm pleased to tell you the outcome of the type of growth path that we have has led us to the level of inequality that we have is worse than Zimbabwe, is worse than Uganda, is worse than Cote d'Ivoire. These countries that have had wars, Sudan, South Sudan, even Botswana, which is 2 million people, ours is worse. It's worse than Djibouti, Eswatini, Lesotho. We are worse than all the SADC regions, including the northwestern and central African countries, in terms of inequality. Why? Because the growth is not spread, and the wealth is not spread and concentrated. And I'll explain some of the reasons. Africa's wealthy. The Lord has blessed Africa. The percentage of gold from Africa is sizable. If I look at just Ghana, Tanzania, and Mali, they have 9% of the gold. South Africa also has a huge portion of the gold. If I look at, on this graph you see behind me, Guinea, the bauxite, 8% of global bauxite comes from where? Here. If I look at cobalt, cobalt is one of the fundamentals for energy, for battery, for cell phone technology. All these cell phones you carry, they require certain inputs. Where do they get the parts from? Here. Do we industrialize it? Do we process it? Do we beneficiate it? Instead, we are told continue to export, use the economic model that the colonialists had in the 1600s, 1700s, 1800s after the Berlin Conference. We haven't changed the structure of our economic path and growth path, and that is what we need to fundamentally change. You can have 53% of all the cobalt, 21% of the diamonds. You can have all exports worth over 170 billion. If you look at Angola and Nigeria in terms of oil export. South Africa's platinum. We are a rich nation. Do not believe the hype. We're not poor. We have 77% of global platinum. We have 46% of chromite, 21% of manganese. These are wealth-generating products, only for a few. But if we can learn how to beneficiate, Europeans met together to decide how to split up all these minerals and make sure that they grow themselves, because without these minerals they realized their growth couldn't happen. And so Africa's destiny was altered. How do you change the destiny of a nation? It's through agreements. It's through agreements. Africa may be a beaming light, but until we unlock and change the agreements that unlock us to economic slavery, I believe it'll be impossible for us to change the growth trajectory. What is the example I have? One of the things that we are deceived at, it's a deception. We're always told we're smaller than we are economically. We're always told we're smaller than we are, even from a geographic point of view. And I just want to prove the point. So here, there's a website called The Visual Capitalist, and they basically plot all of economic numbers in this nice visual way. So they did this very nicely. So what they did here was they plotted, let me show you the square kilometers and the maps behind it. So they took the United States. How big is the United States? It's 9.83 million square kilometers, right? How big is it in relation to Africa? 32%. So then they take Africa, they take the US and they put it in the map of Africa based on the land mass of Africa. They did the same for China. China's 9.6 million in terms of square meters, 31%, slightly smaller than US, but they put it where? In the African. So they did this for India and all the other nations. So you see India's 3.2 million, right? It's 10% of the size of Africa. So what does that look like? This looks like this. So this is China in Africa in terms of land mass. This is US in terms of land mass. This is all the other countries. India, you can put the whole of Eastern Europe, Italy, Germany, France, Spain, Japan, and the UK. So they nicely visualize it. But if you look at a map, is this reflected? No. Let me show you. Can you see how the map should be? This is how the map is. This is how the map should be. We are deceived to believe we're smaller than we are. Can you see this? This is the map we have been told in our geography class. I did geography. I did very well in geography at school, by the way. But I didn't know that we are actually bigger than all these other continents. Now, if they can deceive us like this just on geography, what about other things? Okay. I'm just doing this in passing. So I'll skip this slide. But I believe that the destiny of nations are altered because we are sold. I'm going to quote a scripture, Genesis 37:27. Come, let us sell him to the Ishmaelites. Let not our hand be upon him, for he is our brother in our flesh. And his brothers listened. Then Midianite traders passed by. The brothers pulled Joseph up, lifted him up out of the pit, sold him to the Ishmaelite for 20 shekels, and they took Joseph to Egypt. The point I want to make here is we were sold in 1885. We continue to sell ourselves with the economic models we have. We continue to sell ourselves short with 20 shekels of silver, and we remain enslaved in the pit. Joseph had, many of you may not know or know, he was given by his father, this is a scriptural quote in Genesis, a coat of many colors. He had a dream and a vision that many would bow down before him, and they were jealous. His own family, they were jealous about the destiny that Joseph had. What did they do? They wanted to kill him. Then one of the brothers was kind enough, Reuben, to say, let's not kill this man. Let's rather just, make it look like this. When he went and he came back, they'd sold the guy. He tore his clothes. So they went and told the father that the guy has been sold. What did they do? They made an agreement. They sold him to someone who was on the way, traders. And this is pertinent because humanity continues to have their destinies altered because of a sale. Agreements are made to your detriment, and so he spent many years in prison. But he had a destiny. So I believe that South Africa has a destiny. I believe Africa, the continent, has a destiny. But the sale will not last forever. The agreement shall be broken. I believe also that Africa has in it the ability to be the breadbasket for many nations together with South Africa. I believe also that there is a purpose upon this continent as well as Africa, South Africa, that it will fulfill, but we need to break the chains that we are in. So we may have all these gifts that God has given us, but sales are pertinent. Judas sold Jesus for 30 pieces of silver. Delilah sold Samson to the Philistine for 10 shekels of silver. This thing of money, selling nations' destiny because of money, it alters the destiny of people, and it also alters the destiny of nations. Why do they do this? To maintain deception. So the deception has to come off. And I believe I'll share a little bit about how to remove the deception. Okay. We will no longer be deceived about how to come out of this. We will no longer love money more than we love the destiny that God has for our nation. And we will no longer be enforced into a systemic slavery that causes us to be bound and not fulfill our destiny. Because Joseph arose. He did come out. He came out and he became prime minister, and I believe we too will come out. When you are a slave, and I must outline this, you're a property of someone else. Even if you have dreams, destiny, gift, vision, you are a slave to someone else. Africans, even if they have all these minerals, all this wealth, all this, whatever the things I can mention, if we're the property of someone else on legal grounds, I must say this, on legal grounds, if our assets are not used for our benefit on legal grounds, we remain slaves. The benefits accrue to another. Someone else is your master. You are obedient, and if you're not obedient to your master, they deal with you, isn't it? Yeah. So, we need to break the economic bonds of slavery. We need to make sure that we do not have economic masters that we answer to using sophisticated economic systems and models, even legal agreements that keep us bound. We need to come out of that. And I believe that the modern day slavery continues. Structural adjustment program, economic debt, trade agreements that are not to the benefit of Africans. The structural adjustment program is really where Africans, many of them in the 80s and 90s, they signed agreements taking away their economic sovereignty. They agreed to liberalize their markets. They agreed to devalue their currencies. They agreed to reduce their expenditure on social goods, healthcare, education. In the long run, they became highly indebted. They couldn't service the debt they borrowed from Bretton Woods institution, the IMF, the World Bank, and they defaulted. And they became, what happens if you're a borrower? A slave to someone. If you're a debtor, you are a slave to someone. So the economic model that we have, where we are told, do not grow, reduce your expenditure, devalue your currency. Doesn't matter if you don't manufacture, as long as you are able to export your minerals. That is slavery until we break that and begin to understand we must grow our production capabilities. Illicit financial flows. Most of the multinationals, not all, but there's a lot of research talking about illicit financial flows of multinationals where they don't pay using sophisticated tax systems. They don't pay their dues, if I could just summarize it like that. There's a lot of research done showing that Africa, even South Africa, loses hundreds of billions of dollars because they don't have the capacity to monitor. But not only that, we have to be able to follow up and deal with the illicit financial flows. Can I tell you, when you don't pay SARS, SARS comes after you. If SARS was able to have the efficacy to also come after those who are doing this to our country and shifting profits using sophisticated tax havens, we would get back a lot of money. My belief is that industrialization is a non-negotiable. We've got to industrialize. Every African country together with South Africa. We've got to see factories rising again. We've got to look at trade policy, our macro policy instruments that speaks to the Reserve Bank, that speak to Treasury, that speak to the economic framework should encourage our industrial capabilities to be boosted. Trade and industry and competition should encourage not just the auto sector, which is the cars that are made from Europe, the brands that are here, but local content, local production and capabilities to be strengthened so that we can see our secondary services or our secondary sector expanding. We've got to have labor absorbing strategies. These are to prioritize sectors like agriculture, sectors that enable, because we have 12 million unemployed South Africans, we therefore need to have a deliberate effort. It will not be from the private sector or only that is able to deal with underdevelopment and unemployment. We have to look at the actual labor absorptive strategies using even the muscle of the state. State procurement becomes key. The public procurement bill becomes key. It is important that the state use its levers to deal with unemployment. We cannot have 3 million discouraged work seekers, 3 million youth who have simply given up looking forward. It is unacceptable. It is something we have realized as a norm, and we simply accept to see young people sitting in the corners, in the townships, in the taverns, because they're frustrated, they're really hopeless, yet we have 78% of all the wealth and the platinum, the cobalt, and all these things that we have. We have to make sure that they are deliberate absorption of these young people in the economic system using employment initiatives, and it has to be done because the private sector and the state must do it together. We also have to boost our food production. This is where agriculture becomes important. Large pockets pockets of poverty in Limpopo, Northern Cape, Eastern Cape, are there, KwaZulu-Natal, because the rural areas and the infrastructure is inadequate in rural areas because of our spatial development patterns of the past, but also we haven't reinvested adequately post-1994, and the deliberate intervention should be, let's develop food, and the church and the people that have land should actually come together and say, what can we do to use the assets that we have to make a contribution in an organized fashion? You've got to look at food production. If another COVID comes and you cannot import all the processed food, what are you going to eat? My time. So I'm going to quickly, domestic resources, our fiscal stimulus, and no, I'm almost done, don't worry. I've got 2 more slides. Good 5 minutes. So I must adhere to the organizers. So I must keep the order. The 7th one is we've got to grow through redistribution. So I've gone 1, 2, 3. I've just jumped to 7. We have to grow through redistribution. BEE has become something that is now almost, I don't want to say it. I sit in the advisory council of the president. So BEE, AfriForum, I don't know the other one, Sakalecha, and these other entities that are vociferously using legal instruments to turn around the gains of 1994 are very clear and deliberate that they do not want the type of transformation that is necessary. Let me unpack this a little bit. Laws were used to ensure exclusivity for a minority in South Africa. Laws were also used to ensure that as a result, for more than 100 years of laws, 1652, but colonialism didn't necessarily come with laws, but I think particularly 1912, you started to see an advent of laws up until the late 1980s that were put in place to make sure economic exclusion was entrenched. It will take laws to ensure inclusion. It will take the same vociferous type of laws that are deliberate in their nature to ensure that there is inclusivity and you bring in those who are outside, who are not. It doesn't mean you must exclude those who are within. And I think this is now where the debate happens. And so growth through redistribution is necessary if you want growth. A lot of studies have been shown, if you have high level of inequality, which South Africa has, and you try to continue to grow, the pockets of growth will be for the very few. And so we need to expand. I saw a video as I entered of a young man talking about an entrepreneurship activity he would like to do. We need to have hundreds of thousands of South Africans owning small businesses. It used to be a culture where South Africans own businesses. It seems that our people are now excluded in even the micro level of business. And it is us who have to then say, what can be done to encourage our people to participate and have access? But we need to forcefully participate and ensure that at every level of entrepreneurship, micro, small, medium, and at the large level, which is your multinational or big business, we actually participate, and deliberate efforts have to be made through laws. And I think we need to have vociferous voices supporting BEE. You are very quiet as a society, as a community. The AfriForums are very loud, but the people that are in need of BEE are very quiet. And I understand at times people are tired because they see it as a handful of people benefiting. But let me tell you, the majority of people, if you had broad-based BEE, if you had a lot of interventions that deliberately enable the state procurement to develop the majority, I tell you, would see a change in the capabilities of our people and the outcomes of our economic outcomes. I come to an end where I argue that in the new wine to new wineskins, we have to change our monopolistic, oligopolistic structures. We have to looking at economic structures that enable, in many industries, and I'll talk to one where many of us are very familiar with. Where do you shop? Where do you buy your groceries? You buy it at probably 3 or 4 places, isn't it? Where do you buy it? Don't say Woolies anyone. enough, you could buy at Woolies, you could be buying at ShopRite Checkers, it's one group. You could be buying at Pick and Pay, you could be buying at Spar, isn't it? What does that tell you? Maybe you buy Boxer. Boxer's owned by Pick and Pay, same group. Now, it tells you that this sector that most of you spend, most of your household income is highly concentrated. That means that a portion of all of your income goes to 4 companies, owned by how many families? If it went to 10,000 companies, and many of the grocery stores we used to have in the corners, I'm not saying we probably can bring those back, but if you had more enterprises and less of a concentrated retail sector, you would have the benefits going to more families, more people, the multiplier effect will be felt across, and you'll see people employed, and it's not multinationals or big corporates. South Africa is highly corporatized. And so you do not see the benefits accruing. They'll go to shareholders, the shareholders that own Pick and Pay, that own Spar Group, and then all these companies I mentioned are listed. And you can see the beneficiaries. They'll tell you your pension funds are the beneficiaries. You get your pension when you're 60, if you get there, or at 65, if you have a pension. But what about now, between now and 60 or 65? So I'm saying we've got to change the way in which we grow. I've spoken about our domestic food production. So I'm going to say in closing, Exodus 6, I'll quote Exodus 6. The Lord says here, I am the Lord, I will bring you out from under the burdens of the Egyptians. I will rescue you from their bondage. I will redeem you with an outstretched arm and with great judgments. My prayer is that the Lord judge these unequal legal agreements. The Lord help to rescue us using the Josephs of this generation who will rebuild the economic patterns of growth like he did for Egypt and the many nations